It is a manual speech. It's number 9, speaking to persuade. And without that, I'll begin talking about 2 friends. See, I am a loner, and I like to be lonesome. I like to be lonely. I like to be alone with my thoughts as my companion. During high school, I rode the bus. And one day, I sat next to a boy and I said hi, and he said hi to me. Some days later, I sat next to that same boy and I said, "Hi, how are you?" And that same boy said, "Hi, how are you?" Eventually, we sat next to each other regularly, and our sentences grew longer, and we became friends. One day, he invited me to his house, and his house was pretty normal, with 2 exceptions. One, in his living room, there was a cot. I didn't really notice anything unusual about the cot, but when I looked at the cot, for some inexplicable reason, I was filled with great sadness. I had a lump in my throat. The same lump that I had the last time I saw my grandfather shortly before he died of cancer. The other odd thing about this house was the landscaping. All the shrubs and trees were meticulously groomed into fantastical shapes. Shapes that I couldn't imagine had I not seen them for myself. I guess I could compare them to the hedges and bushes that were in the movie Edward Scissorhands, if anybody's seen that. These were different shapes, but equally fantastical. My friend was a great artist, and his parents' yard was just another canvas to him. My friend was deformed. He was a hunchback. He told me that he was a reincarnated fish because his parents had a humpback fish that died the day he was born. I was surprised to find out that he had a girlfriend. I was surprised to find out because of his condition, but he had a girlfriend. I knew who the girlfriend was, but I didn't know her personally. Everybody knew who she was. She was actually very popular and very pretty. And his best friend, I was not his best friend, his best friend was a very handsome man, very muscular, great-looking face. Well, eventually, a love triangle took place, with the best friend and the girlfriend having a sexual affair. I wondered about that because my friend stayed friends with his best friend, even after this affair was known. And I thought back to that cot, and I found out later that it was a medical device upon which he had spent many excruciating hours. And I could only imagine that he chose to remain friends with this other person because he had suffered so much in his life and suffered so much pain that he would rather stay friends with this enemy than be alone. He told me that the doctors didn't understand his anatomy and that he was supposed to die by the time he turned age 30. I lost track of this friend, and he lived down the street from my parents, and I still visit them fairly regularly. We all live here in the valley, and as I would drive by, all of a sudden one day I noticed that the bushes were a little fuzzy and weren't quite as crisp as they used to be. Eventually, over time, they grew out and became typical, anonymous, unremarkable shrubs. I know this friend would now be over 30, and I hope that medical science caught up with his condition and that he's living somewhere independently with a life full of love and great works of art. I'm also gregarious, even loquacious at times, and I don't know a stranger. There was a boy in school whom I didn't know. But I knew of him because for an entire school year, he had to wear an apparatus, a medical device that looked like a crash helmet. That makes you stand out when you're in grade school. I didn't know him then, but I ended up in a remedial math class with this boy. I didn't start out in a remedial math class. I started out in algebra. And one day, during the silence of an exam, the math teacher walked up behind me and knocked on my head with his knuckles and said, "There's nobody home." And he sent me to the remedial math class. I never understood his hatred for me. Perhaps I reminded him of a child who didn't turn out the way he had hoped. Or maybe I reminded him of some rival that stole his heart's desire in earlier years. But one consequence of his actions is I was sat next to the boy with the crash helmet. We had typical interactions you would have with a classmate. Can I borrow a pencil? But I wouldn't have considered him a friend at that point until one day, one of the cool kids in the class said to him, "Phil, you're ugly and your mama dresses you funny." The whole class laughed, except for Phil and me and the teacher, to her credit. Phil immediately had a new friend and an ally. As I got to know Phil, I found out that his home life was really bad. Ever since the time of the accident, a car accident that put him in that crash helmet, his mother was very abusive, belittling him constantly. There was even some mild physical abuse. And he told me one time that he was visited each night by a blue flower that gave him power and strength, and that's how he survived. He also confided in me that he prayed for his mother to die. I lost track of this friend, but in our early 20s, consequently, the consequence would have us that we were reunited. And we talked about things, and I asked him eventually about his mother, and his face brightened. He told me that he met somebody who told him that he ought to pray for his mother's happiness. And he followed that advice, and his mother did become happy. It took a divorce and a new love to make her happy, but that's how she became happy. Her new husband was an enormous man, and he would pick her up over his head and twirl her around, and this middle-aged woman would laugh and giggle like a little girl. Again, I lost track of Phil, and in our late 20s, again, I caught up with him. And I asked him about his mother. And this time, his face darkened. His mother was dead. She was stabbed by her new lover, who was at that point serving time in Texas in some facility for the criminally insane. Despite the cognitive impairment that the car accident that he had in his youth had on his mind, it didn't escape him the ironic cruelty of his mother's fate. And he felt very responsible for that because both of his prayers were answered in the reverse order. He prayed for her to die, and then he prayed for her happiness. She became happy, and then she died. By the time she died, they were friends again, and they loved one another, and the relationship had been repaired. These two friends were bound to one another, not through mutual friendship with me, but by a bond that's exactly as thick as blood. I don't want to become too specific about what that bond is, because these are real events from my life, and although they've been compressed in terms of the timeline for storytelling's sake, they are true events. But to reveal that relationship between those two people would make my story too implausible. But I do want you to know that bond is there. So whether you own to a God that creates the universe and puts people and events in our life, or whether you're purely rational and can marvel that randomness can cobble together everything from a duck-billed platypus to Lady Gaga, I have a plea for you. Take a close look at the people next to you. If divinity or randomness can produce life, it is probably wiser than our own prejudices and inclinations. My life, I am a better, richer person.